Welcome. Hello. I'm letting all attendees listen in. We're still going to stay on mute for a little while longer, and we'll get started on time in about 4 minutes. Welcome, Laura Wernick. Glad to see you're on.
Hi. How are you all doing?
We're fine, thank you.
Me?
Yeah, I can hear you fine. This is Elisabeth. I'm just not seeing any of our participants, any of our regular attendees showing up yet, which surprises me. Usually there are at least a few who jump on early.
Yeah. Yeah, I thought you were that some people were going to be with Erika. That there was
Yeah, Laura is the other Laura is with Erika at Erika's office,
okay.
And then Claire Barnett and I are here in Denver
Sounds like
at the conference.
Okay.
Hi, Laura.
And
Is this Claire?
No, it's the other Laura.
Oh, hi, Laura. How are you?
Good.
Good.
Oh, good. We have.
Are you with Erika?
Someone who.
Yeah, Erika's here.
Welcome.
Hey there.
Ben, welcome. I see you joined us. Can you hear us?
Yep.
Elisabeth?
Hello.
Hello? Okay. Yeah, everything went dead there for a minute.
Okay. Yep, I'm here. Just making sure everyone's joining on. Hello, everyone. This is Elisabeth Krautscheid. It's exactly 11 o'clock, and I had really wanted to get started on time because I know everyone's schedules are important. We have a couple people, it looks like, just signing in right now, so I'm going to give everyone another 30 to 45 seconds. Okay, Welcome again. This is Elisabeth again. We're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to our webinar on From Research to Action, Evidence-Based Design for Healthy School Buildings. We have had a slight change in our speaker lineup due to circumstances beyond our control. Chin Lin is not able to join us, but his colleague Laura Wernick is going to be filling in for him on the topic of acoustics. We also are happy to welcome Claire Barnett from the Healthy Schools Network, who will assist me with the introduction since I am losing my voice due to allergies, and apologies for how I sound. And we do have Erika Eitland and Laura Schwesa joining us again. And Laura, I apologize if I did not say your last name correctly. You and I both have difficult last names. So let's go ahead and get started. I want to say thank you to HMFH Architects in Cambridge for assisting us with the logistics and for loaning us Chin's time, and Laura for you stepping in when we needed you. Also to Harvard University, the T.H. Chan School of Public Health, they also have been very helpful with logistics. And to Claire, because she was the inspiration for this webinar in the first place. If anyone online is an architect and wants to earn credits for this class, we are approved to do that. So I have to go through a few required slides. This is the course description. And I want to shout out that we are doing this in honor of National Healthy Schools Day and Autism Awareness Month. Those both occurred in April. So we are the very tail end of the meteor on this one, but we're very happy to be doing it in spite of that. So this course description is the same one that you would have seen when you registered, and we're going to cover what is a healthy school, what the research has been telling us, what are we learning from studies into people with special needs and sensory issues, and how we can use design to calm the environment for them, and how important things like thermal comfort and daylighting and acoustics are. Required by AIA for learning objectives. I think these are pretty self-explanatory. I'll let you take a quick look at them, particularly anyone who wants to get credits for this class. And we will be making the slides available, and this webinar is also being recorded, and we will be able to share that. So very briefly, I'm going to introduce everyone, so that you don't have to listen to my gravelly voice too much. I'm Elisabeth Krautscheid, the one on the upper right. I'm Managing Director of CHPS. I have had that position for a year now, and prior to that, I worked in energy efficiency in green buildings in affordable rental housing. And prior to that, I ran the Mass CHPS program some time ago, which was coupled with the renewable energy program, where schools that achieved Mass CHPS verification also got a PV system. So that was a fun program, and that's how I got to know CHPS as an organization and the work they do. Erika Eitland joins us from Harvard University from the T.H. Chan School of Public Health. She's a third-year doctoral candidate there, and her passion is for how the built environment affects student and teacher health and performance. She's also the lead author of a study that I have posted as part of this webinar, so that should be available to participants as a handout. It's the study they published last year on schools for health. Laura S. joins us, also with Erika at her office. Laura is a researcher and consultant on school designs when special needs are being considered. She has a Master's of Architecture from Boston Architectural College, and I've seen her present on her subject matter, and it's just fascinating and so compelling. Laura Wernick joins us from HMFH Architects. She's senior principal there, and she has a really fun bio. I had a lot of fun reading it. She has some very interesting hobbies and passions, including airplane and glider flying, which sounds awesome. But she is particularly knowledgeable about the physical, emotional, social, and pedagogical aspects of education and integrating them into the built environment. So thank you to all of our speakers. I wanted to put these quotes in front of you to warm you up and get you thinking about the subject matter that we're covering today. And while I just have the screen up, I'm going to turn it over to Claire to give more of an introduction as to why we're all in this business.
Great. Thank you, Elisabeth. Can you all hear me? Is that good? Wonderful. My name's Claire Barnett. I'm Executive Director of Healthy Schools Network, founded in 1995. We promote school facilities through leadership on policy reforms in many states. We're very interested in some hard topics like lead in paint and drinking water. non-toxic products in schools, safer pest control. So it's clean water and clean air for every child in school. I want to say a little bit in terms of introduction about how we look at this issue, our framework. We know that biologically children are not just little adults. They breathe more air per pound of body weight. They can identify hazards and so forth. We also know that schools are not just little offices. They sure don't operate that way, and they shouldn't be built that way. Today, there are about 55 million children in public and private schools, about 130,000 buildings. There are more children today in fewer public school buildings than there were about 5 years ago. More children in poverty, more children from low-income communities, and more children enrolling in schools with pre-existing health and learning problems. So for us, the condition of the building is really very much an equity issue. The children who need the best conditions for learning often get the worst, and that is a very large problem for every state because every state has compulsory education laws. So I am really delighted today to be participating with CHPS to offer the last, but certainly not the least, of all the activities for the 16th Annual National Healthy Schools Day that was held a month ago. And I'm delighted that we're coordinating this with Autism Awareness Month. I think these things go together really, really well. We know that lots of children arrive in school with their own personal barriers across a wide range of issues. And it's certainly time for schools to make sure there are no additional barriers that have inadvertently been introduced to the setting. Thanks, Elisabeth.
You're welcome. Thank you for that very much. So I'm going to give you our definition from the CHPS perspective on what is a healthy school. And there are really two definitions in my mind. One is that if you take our approach to high performance schools as a whole, that is really what a healthy school is. Healthy and high performance go hand in hand. They really are two sides of the same coin. But you could also look at it from a more technical perspective, which is, what do our criteria say? And so the first element of a healthy school is it's got to have good indoor air, also known as IAQ. And here are the different elements within our criteria. So we're talking about low toxic materials, we're talking about green cleaning, we're talking about good ventilation, moisture control, making sure that during construction things aren't contaminated or left dirty, and low radon. The next one is that the environment needs to be comfortable temperature-wise. This is known in design circles as thermal comfort, of course, so we're really talking again about the HVAC system, but also about teachers being able to control how the room feels. Good lighting is extremely important. This includes daylighting. It also includes the quality of the electric lighting. And circadian lighting is very important for helping kids to stay awake and perform during the day. We are also concerned about not exposing kids to electromagnetic wiring. It's important to have views of outdoors. Now, Laura S. is going to get into this a little bit and talk about how for some kids a view can be very distracting, but in general, a view of outdoors is considered to be a good thing. Acoustics are extremely important, and Laura W. will be talking to us about that aspect. And then last, but definitely not least, something that we're going to be adding this year to our criteria is this concept of a calm environment and what that means, particularly when you're designing either separate classrooms for special needs, but also inclusive classrooms. Oops. And with that, I'm actually going to change the presenter. Sorry to be awkward about it. Over to Erika and Laura S. So bear with me for a moment. And there we go.
Excellent. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
I can hear you fine.
Excellent. Okay, great. Thank you so much to Elisabeth, Claire, everybody who's made this happen. Lisa, it's such a great opportunity to sort of be able to talk to you all about the research that's sort of informing this important actions we have to be taking. And I really wanting to give a special thanks for the Collaborative for High Performance Schools for all of their efforts over the more than 20 years, because it really allows us to have a launching pad for the research and put it into an important context. So my name is Erika Eitland. I'm a third-year doc candidate at the Department of Environmental Health at the Harvard Chan School, but I'm also the program leader for the Schools for Health team. And this is actually a part of a much larger entity here at Harvard known as the Healthy Buildings team, under the guidance of Dr. Joseph Allen. And our mission is simple. We want to promote healthy environments for all people everywhere. We have a really excellent, diverse group of researchers with us, including airline pilots and engineers from all over the world, that give us a sort of a unique angle to talk about aviation, homes, impact of climate change, and schools. And so our goal within this team is to create tools for translating science into action. And one of our sort of leading frameworks for this is our 9 foundations of a healthy building. And this is sort of undermines all of the work that we do when we think about what are the must-haves versus the like-to-haves. And so each of these foundations, because we're very much in translating the work, has been focused on developing 2-pagers that go through the last 30 years of research and have about 40 to 50 papers cited for each one of these characteristics, and are hoping to sort of create transparency and have high integrity in the research that we're doing so that we can sort of answer the questions, what's most important, how are we exposed to these factors, and then what can we do about it? But within this, and thinking about all of the different spaces that we occupy, we work, live, and learn in, Claire said it best, and it's something that I always start my talks with, which is children are not little adults. And I think this is really a valuable starting place because when we think about the current building standards, we treat them as if they are. So if we think about ASHRAE 55, going to Elisabeth's point about thermal comfort, we really see this as an issue of thermal health. And those original studies are actually based on college males in 3-piece suits. And yet what we're seeing is that children have larger body surface areas. They're not actually able to sweat in the same way that adults are. We see that they have a mature immune system. And then there's sort of a social component that we also have to be aware of, which is they have less efficacy to make decisions about the environments that they exist within. And so, when we think about it from an exposure assessment standpoint, these are long durations of exposure, so about 15,000 hours by the time they graduate 12th grade. And they're exposed to different types of pollutants in different spaces, whether it be on the floor or they're more likely to be outside than adults. And yet, something that I know Laura will touch on and we all sort of echoed is that the potential of these students. So unlike the office worker, our little adults, in this case, have their whole life ahead of them. And so when we see that there's sort of these early adverse events, as documented in the ACE study, we're seeing that it can have impact on earnings, cognitive function, and mortality. And it really emphasizes this point that we need to be using the school buildings as a public health intervention that is going to have a ripple effect, not just today, but in the long term. So with that in mind, the Healthy Buildings team embarked on going through almost 300 research articles that we felt were of a caliber to share with all of you. This is a report that was released last year, and it uses, again, the 9 foundations as our frame, but it dives into almost 70 health performance indicators. So this is everything from cognitive function to asthma. And it's diversifying the way that we quantify school success. So instead of sort of our narrow focus, which is typically on test scores that determine funding, we're saying that there's a lot of different ways that we can really sort of have the best metrics to understand, is our school really healthy? Because I think with any of our frameworks, we're thinking about the exposure, but this allows us to really understand what's the impact, and now not only track, but target these specific pieces and remove some of that ambiguity, no matter where you are in the country. What was fascinating about diving into all of this work, though, was that we started to develop this underlying conceptual framework, which was that health is foundational to student success. So student performance is a really interesting component because when we think about test scores, they're actually susceptible to both acute impact and long-term impact of a poor school building. And so this can be where we think about if you're having allergies or a common cold that day, you're not able to focus. and have that attention and comprehension. And if it's, a temperature in a specific classroom with the north-south facing window, what's really important in this context is that you could be losing critical minutes of your math class every single day. And so your student performance at the end of the academic year could actually be a function of having lost, an accumulation of that time. So what I think is really valuable, and I think why webinars like this are extremely important, is this idea of a virtuous cycle. So as a public health researcher, I'm looking at it from sort of a narrow lens, but what I have valued so much in working with my colleagues at HMFH and CHPS is this ability to think about how can we translate our work. And there'll be a really nice example, I think, later on in this presentation that sort of exemplifies that. But ultimately, research can inform design and maintenance practices, and then we can ultimately promote healthier occupants. But I think what's important is that we recognize that this is an iterative process. It's a moving target, and as we get sort of a better understanding of the research, we can keep saying, how do we optimize our students' learning environment? And so with that, thinking about how do we overcome what I see as numerous challenges. So there's a lot on this slide, which has been sort of an accumulation of a lot of different conversations with different stakeholders as they try to work towards getting to a healthier school building, and with that, hoping that we can do it together. So my urgency is realizing sort of the prevalence of an issue. So being within public health, we're really about the population health sciences. What we're seeing is that we do have a tremendous percentage of our schools that are not meeting our 21st century needs. And what we're seeing is that, something like having 60,000 school buildings that don't have an IAQ manager also results in 13.8 million school days missed due to asthma in 2014. And so wanting to be able to think about the research, whether it's self-reported, continuously monitored, we're seeing that the data is very clear and that there is this evidence for action. So to kind of get us started, I'm going to only dive into sort of 4 key components of this overall 9 foundations. I encourage you to read more. The first being, though, the impact of high CO2. And so the building standard that we use is ASHRAE 62.1 that uses a threshold of 1,000 parts per million for CO2. And yet what we're seeing across the country, across many different types of studies, is that we're often failing to miss that mark. And so that means that our ventilation rates are below the 7.1 liters per, second person. I'm like talking really fast. I want to take a sip of water real quick. And be able to think about sort of not only what are those individual ventilation rates, but also what are sort of the average concentrations that we're experiencing in this space. So on average, we are exceeding that 1,000 parts per million, but we're also seeing peak concentration of 3,000 parts per million. And that this isn't isolated in 1 or 2 classrooms. We're seeing that 20% of classrooms reach the 3,000 parts per million threshold in the Southwest U.S. And so what's interesting about this for me is that when we improve ventilation and when we look at students specifically and increase ASHRAE to 20 CFMs per person, there's this really incredible moment where you see that we can save $160 million in caregiving resources. So if your student is absent or they're not sick, there's this sort of ripple effect that we have, magnitude different in improving our air quality versus the sort of energy cost that's associated with that. And so to work through this framework is to think that, when we see high CO2, the impacts are both communicable diseases, the personal issues that students are coming with chronic asthma coming in and seeing it exacerbated in these spaces. We also see that self-reported symptoms are also on the increase when we have high CO2. But the ripple effect of that is thinking about these reductions in attention, comprehension, concentration, and that ultimately influence our students' ability to have, high performance in math, reading, and science in English. So today in Massachusetts, we're actually in the midst of MCAS testing. This is our standardized test in the state. And what's interesting about this is thermal health is what we call it in our team, because it's not just about being comfortable. It's how it actually has a direct relationship to what you're feeling in those spaces. So a lot of these studies are actually targeting university students. We don't have a lot of literature on K-12 students, but again, knowing that children are not little adults, we expect that the impact is greater. And so in this study, looking at temperature and CO2, we're seeing that there's impacts on your mucosal system and headaches and tiredness. And what I think is an important interaction is the fact that we're computerizing a lot of our classrooms. So even with MCAS testing, we're seeing that last year 500,000 students took computerized tests. This is, we have only 1 million students in the whole state. And we're seeing that there's this internal thermal load as well as an external thermal load when we think about increasing temperatures due to climate change. This is relevant because when we think about the fact that on Monday it was 60 degrees here in Boston and now it's 90 today, our students don't actually have the ability to acclimatize as fast as adults do. And so therefore, when we looked at an example of a paper that was published last year, they looked at 75,000 students in New York State, and they found that you were 12% more likely to fail the exam if you took that exam on a 90-degree day versus a 75-degree day. And so this is an important piece because it's equivalent to the black-white achievement gap. And when we think about cities like New York, which in 50 years are going to have the same temperature as Roanoke, Virginia, it's important that we start to think about how do we intervene? How do we, if the science is telling us this, how do we use our school building as a way to promote our well-being and actually capture our students' success and ability instead of how they're being exposed to their environment? The next piece that I'd like to talk about is the idea of lighting. So again, thinking about current building standards, we have a lot of focus on illuminance and recognizing that flicker and glare are important and have been shown to be associated with headaches. But to something that Elisabeth has mentioned earlier is this incredible sensitivity to the circadian rhythm, which we even see in younger adolescents being much stronger than in older adolescents, and this ability for melatonin suppression to be also directly affected by the light that they're experiencing. And so how do we think about that in terms of students thinking within this framework is that using lighting that's similar, or what we like to call artificial daylighting, somewhere around the 6,500 Kelvin temperature range, is we're seeing that it's associated with alertness and improvements in computerized test scores. And it can be helpful when we think about these seasonal differences, in winter not having that same trigger that we might in spring, summer, but also recognizing that school buildings built in the 70s, because of the energy crisis, removed a lot of their windows. And so not having an external trigger, so beyond thinking about views, just having that circadian trigger to be there. And so the thinking about sort of student performance and bringing it all together. So when you have lighting that not only is sort of glare-free, focused lighting, and is also using that artificial daylighting, you're seeing improvements in oral reading fluency performance, which is extremely important. And I think what I'm excited about, and something that, again, thinking about these moving targets, how we optimize our students' well-being, is the idea of how do we use tunable lighting and innovation within these spaces. Just because this has worked in one population of students doesn't mean it's a fit for everybody. And so how can we take the innovation and really sort of solve the need at the same time? So the last sort of key component that I want to talk about is noise and acoustics, which is thinking about not only sort of the auditory impacts, but the non-auditory impacts. And so we've set a threshold, and I know Laura Warnickel is going to talk more about this, so I'm going to keep it brief, but really sort of thinking about what are the ripple effects when we have all these different sources. So aircraft noise in schools is a really interesting sort of subset of the research where we're seeing it having direct impact on the behavior of teachers. And so in this case, this is a study out of the EU, which they're showing that 86% of teachers reported keeping windows closed even in warmer weather. So there's a link back to previous things that we discussed, which is you're having, maybe your thermal health is compromised because the classroom is not allowed to cool naturally. You're also seeing the impact on CO2 potentially because you don't have this ventilation. The next piece is the fact that they also were 38% less likely to go outside with their students. And this has ripple effects on obesity and physical activity as well. But what I find interesting is also beyond thinking about the auditory response, which is that students are more susceptible to noise interference and need a larger signal-to-noise ratio, is that they also are experiencing things that we cannot see or directly understand. That our kids' heart rates increasing while we're sitting in a noisy classroom is not something a teacher can kind of detect and pick up on. And so therefore, this is where I think the science kind of fills the gap. And so what we're also seeing is that HVAC systems are commonly an internal source of noise. And yet what we're looking at in research coming out of Florida is that the noisiest HVAC systems resulted in underperforming on standardized testing. And the schools with the highest percentage of low socioeconomic students had the noisiest systems of all. So realizing that there's some underlying EJ issues and that there's really unique interactions between all of these 9 foundations. And so as we try to optimize one, we have to be thinking about the consequences on the others. So with all this information in this very sort of dense report, what we came to realize is that there's enough evidence for action, but with limited resources across school districts across the U.S., we wanted to answer where must we act first. And so this led us to developing the Massachusetts School Metrics and Research Tools database. And basically the purpose was that when you cannot do an invasive classroom by classroom study, how do you create a portal that connects the environmental, social determinants of health, as well as student outcomes? And so what we're seeing is a really interesting, diverse group of data that we think is valuable for everyone to have access to, which is, connecting crime data, educational attainment, greenness from both census data, but also NASA satellite imaging. We're looking and have partnered with our local school building authority to understand what are their needs assessments telling us about these buildings, and then ultimately, how is it impacting our students broadly. So the first research question that we aimed to answer was this idea of satellites to schools and thinking about how do we target chronic absenteeism, which is a metric of missing 10% of an academic year due to excused and unexcused absences, and is becoming a really important accountability metric identified by the Every Student Succeeds Act. So what we're seeing is across the U.S. there's over 33 states now who have adopted chronic absenteeism as their non-academic performance indicator. And so to me, this is an important piece because it also has public health ramifications, where chronic absenteeism, especially in earlier grades, is known to be mostly driven by K-12 or by health-related reasons, including asthma and maybe family issues. And so this photo that I'm showing you is actually a satellite image of the MODIS data, whereby we have a satellite that goes around the world every 16 days, and we're starting to understand what's the impact of air quality and surrounding greenness on our schools in Massachusetts. So going really macro to micro. And so our air quality measure in this case is PM2.5, or particulate matter that's 2.5 microns in size. So you see on the left that human hair is actually much larger. And so when we think about our students, again, it's recognizing that they have larger lung surfaces, that their immune systems are not fully developed, they have greater lung epithelial permeability, and so that there is sort of an important impact that we have to think about in kids beyond adults. This normalized difference vegetation index is a really exciting objective measure of greenness. So it includes both all the grass, trees surrounding your school, and what we've seen using this metric in other studies in K-12 environments is an improvement in test scores, reduction in stress, fatigue, and aggression. So it's I think two very important pieces for us to think about in the context of chronic absenteeism. What we were able to do, because of kind of how we were able to connect all this different data, is look at chronic absenteeism per school across the state for the 2012-2013 year. And what this is showing is that there's, clustering of high chronic absenteeism around urban centers, including Boston, Fall River, Springfield. And so this is sort of an interesting thing for us to start thinking about. But after finding these results, what we realized is that there was with small improvements, both greenness and particulate matter, we were seeing that there was, tens of thousands of benefits, in reductions of number of students being absent. And so with that, going to Chinlin, who I'm sad is not here with us, but I'm glad Laura is, went to Chin's office and said, this is what the research is showing. What can we do about it, and how do we take this science and turn it into something that's accessible and practical? And what was interesting about this is we started to talk about, first of all, particulate matter and thinking about the indoor air quality. And so improving filtration, improving building envelopes to reduce particle intrusion. But even thinking about it at the design phase of where are you siting your school buildings, and seeing that there's lots of studies showing that our siting of school buildings is flawed, and that we're exposing our students to high levels of neurotoxicants and things that are reducing lung function. And so trying to create diverse ways of doing that. But then what I found really interesting was his discussion about structural soil. So knowing that a lot of the clustering of high chronic absenteeism is in these urban centers, how do you take the little bit of land and landscaping that you might have and really sort of transform it into a more green environment? And so structural soil allows you to optimize canopy and tree cover and allowing to sort of take advantage of nutrients that you might not have actually had access to. And in the study, what we found was that the racial breakdown of the students, as well as the household income for that county, were also equally important in this discussion. But what's important about our paper is this sort of holistic impact, where we think about environment and social, and not just sort of using programs or teacher-focused issues to be able to say, this is how we solve chronic absenteeism. We actually have a really exciting opportunity to enhance our efforts to do both. And so with that, kind of the key takeaways that I want to share with you is that health is foundational to student success and performance. I think it's important, and Laura's going to really sort of transition and show how valuable this is, but thinking about what do your students need. And so the acknowledgement that the 9 foundations are interacting in unique ways, and they're influencing all of our students differently. And that we have to challenge our current standards. So whether it's lighting and thinking about circadian rhythm, as CHPS has done, or challenging IAQ and saying ASHRAE 62.1 is not appropriate for students. How do we do better? I think we're uniquely placed because CHPS has been a leader for 20 years, and I think we can start to sort of challenge the status quo when we adopt and define these healthy school metrics and collaborate and work together. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Laura Shrestha. I'm a Boston Masters of Architecture college student. I worked with Dr. Dak Kopek on my project and Dr. Temple Grandin while I was doing my master's thesis. And what we were working on is sensory integration design, because currently there's really not, ADA guidelines cover physical disabilities, not those who have neurocognitive disabilities. And I wanted to figure out why we don't have anything for that. A little background about me is I have ADHD and I am dyslexic, and I have 2 kids who are autistic as well. So that's where my interest lied in that, but also that I come from a family of history of neurocognitive disabilities like depression, anxiety, PTSD, just a whole host of things. So I grew up around it, I've seen it, and I realized that the way that I learned while going through school was completely different than the peers that I had, and that I went through special education through 1st through 4th grade, and then I was put into regular classrooms after that. But it was because of my disability and my inability to be able to control sound and the sensitivity that I had to light that affected me, and because of my disability. Now, I'm going to show a quick video that shows you what a sensory processing disorder is, or a neurocognitive disorder is. It was made by Upworthy. It starts out slow. It's going to go in the neurotypical, and then it goes straight into those who have a neuroprocessing disorder or sensory sensitivity. Bear with me, it starts out slow. The video's not showing up. Stuck. All right, so that was me showing you what a sensory sensitivity is for those in the world of autism. Now, I'm going to also show you how you've experienced it yourself. If you've ever driven in your car and you're looking for a new address, and as you get closer to the new place that you're getting to, you turn down the radio to see where you're going, that is a sensory disorder. You are taking something that you're listening to turn down for you to see something. So you've experienced it, you just experience it in a different way than us with neurocognitive disorders normally experience it. People with autism, ADHD, PTSD, anxiety, depression, bipolar disorder experience it 10 times greater than a neurotypical person would. And when it comes to designing for us and understanding us, realize that we have different details than a neurotypical person will have. One example I give is my husband. When he first moved here, they asked if he could be a designated driver. And he asked what a designated driver was. And I told him as a person who doesn't drink and drives everyone home after a night. So we all got drunk. We all piled into his car. And the next thing we know, we're in front of this building and he's turning off the car and walking up the driveway. And we were like, where are you going? And he said, designated driver says that you're supposed to drive everyone home. I drove everybody home. This is my home. And he walked into the door and closed it. And the next day I told him, okay, what was your definition of what a designated driver is? And he told me, and if you go look in Wikipedia, you can see it shows this is what it said, and this is what he showed me, and it's still there today, what a designated driver is. He was right. It says drive everyone home. It didn't say drive everyone to their each individual houses. That's what's implied. But he didn't know this because he was going off of a literal definition of what it is. So I use this analogy because he is a literal thinker. That means you have to give him the full exact amount of information for him to understand it, and you can't give generalized information, and you have to not give slang or something like that. He would be, if you have ever watched The Big Bang Theory, if you took Kuthra Kali and Sheldon Cooper and put them together, that is what I'm married to. He is a literal thinker in all sense of the word, and it's interesting to see how his mind works. I also wanted to point out that even though we have ADA put in place, we have ADA put in place for people who have hearing disabilities, vision disabilities, we have them for ambulatory disabilities, but they make up a small portion of the students going to school K through 12, while we with cognitive disabilities make up way more than they do. And we are just as important as they are. The only difference between them and us is they have a physical disability you can see and therefore recognize, while cognitive disabilities are still being unrecognized. Not to mention there's an asterisk next to this because we're still going against gender bias, racial bias, cultural bias, social bias, so many different biases that we're going against to get a diagnosis. Autism until recently was thought to be only boys got autism, but now we realize that girls also do. They present differently. which is also another issue that boys and girls present differently when they have different disorders. A boy with ADHD does not present the same as a girl with ADHD. Same thing would go for heart attacks. Women do not have the same kinds of symptoms as a man would have when having heart attack. So it's really hard to do the diagnosis. The only problem is most of the diagnoses that have been researched has been based off of studies of males, which makes it harder for females to be diagnosed because they present completely different. And I mean, there's so many different things that also go into it, and stereotypes that go into each diagnosis. Realize that autism is a spectrum. Not all autistics are alike. ADHD is a spectrum. Not all people with ADHD, and bipolar disorder, and so on. There are people with high, there are people with low. It's completely different for every person. And so if you meet someone with a neurocognitive disorder of a certain type, you've met that one person with that disorder. So we also looked at self-care and independent living, which jumps when they hit 22. I'm pretty sure a lot of you know what the age out process is. When they hit 22, they age out of the school, or when they hit 18, they graduate from school. And they are now out in the world with none of that structure that they had K through 12 through college. It's gone. So you see an uptick in numbers of students facing living on the street, getting in trouble with the law, because also a lot of neurocognitive disorders do not begin to present themselves until between 20 and 25, which is when schizophrenia and bipolar disorder starts presenting themselves. And it's harder to diagnose as well. So in order to understand what a sensory processing disorder is and understanding how we work, because those of neurocognitive disorders majorly have a sensory processing disorder, you have to understand what that is. So there's your exteroceptive senses, which are your common senses that you have, your taste, your touch, your vision, and then your interoceptive sense, which is your gut feeling. So if you are a person, for example, who has anxiety, your gut is constantly telling you something is wrong, and it misfires against your exteroceptive senses because your exteroceptive senses tell you and just tells the gut feeling, you were right, we must get out of here. So that's how, for example, that would work for that. But it's these two things misfiring off of each other constantly. Realize that some people can be hypersensitive, some people can be hyposensitive. So they can have a high sensitivity. For me, it's light and sound, or they can have a low sensitivity. For those who like to self-inflict and punch themselves or hit themselves, they're doing it because they need that deep pressure, that sudden pain, because they have a hyposense. And then there's a sensory overload, when they become so overfilled with sensory information that they implode. So we normally do stemming, and there's socially acceptable stemming, and everyone stems. Here's the thing that people get wrong. You stem all the time. You tap your foot, you tap your pencil, you twirl your hair, you chew your nails, that's stemming. You all do it. So there's accessible stemming, and then there is to a degree that is not socially acceptable. The guy covering his ears and screaming really loud as the train goes by, he's doing the exact same thing you're doing with your headphones on, drowning out the noise. The only thing is you're doing it in a socially acceptable way. He is not. And you can also lose your ability to feel stimulation. Patty Mandel, a woman who helped me with my project, told me that when she goes to the doctor's office, when she hits the lobby, and by the time she gets to her appointment, she already has dyscalculia, which means she cannot tell numbers, but she loses her ability to read. She loses her ability to tell direction, and she also loses her ability to talk. And she has said that she's a bolter, so she has come to in the middle of the street with cars honking at her with no idea how she got there. And at one particular time, she told me she came to in the middle of a lake, and that was when she decided, well, maybe I should learn how to swim.
and went to her local Y to learn this, because those who have autism in particular and who have ADHD tend to walk around in a dazed state or drift off or daydream or wander off or bolt away from safe zones. And we're 58% more likely to do it between the ages of 4 to, I believe, 12. And of that 58%, 90% end up being hurt significantly or die because they've been hit by cars, or they end up in lakes and drown. And I don't know how many times we've seen newspaper articles of kid wanders away from party, has autism, found in lake, kid wanders away from Christmas time, party. All of these things have the same issue. We're in a social setting, too many people, tried to get away from too many people, much noise, too many bodies in the room, and ended up hurting themselves. And they don't do it on purpose. And this is where they also have the opposite effects, which normally that would be the flight mode. There's also the fight mode. And then, there's fight, flight, and fright. And then there's shutdown, which is a common meltdown as well. Now, there's a difference between what a meltdown is and what a tantrum is. A tantrum is because Susie couldn't get the toy she wanted. That is a tantrum. A meltdown is a complete breakdown of self-control due to overstimulation, that you are no longer in control of your body and what you're doing, which is a very common thing for people with sensory processing disorder. And often they're told, oh, you need to quit having tantrums when things don't go your way. It's not like they can control this. So Temple Grandin was able to do this book on that she talked about the many different ways of how people with sensory processing disorder and autism think. She has the visual logic thinkers who think in pictures like she does. So when I tell you to go put on your shoes, you see your shoes. The pattern thinkers that think, oh, the pattern of shoes that will match my dress. The verbal thinkers that see the word shoes. But I argued with her that my husband, when I tell him to go put on his shoes, he feels the texture of the shoe he wants to wear on his foot. So he is a texture thinker. Everything is a different texture, which he hates being touched because each sounds have texture, food has texture. So it's very hard for him walking around because everything involves texture, especially with people's voices and stuff like that. So he is a sensory thinker, and I know he's not alone. So I did a survey, and I went and I looked at many disabilities. I threw this survey up on any number of social media that I could find, and I found a commonality with all of these disabilities, and for those who have synesthesia, which is an ability, was able to find that they're triggered mostly by sound, then followed by vision, then touch, then movement. But all of this focuses on the people around them. So the more people, the more noise they have, and that was what it was. So it's not just that these are the sensory focuses, it's that people around them, this is what they were finding. And while I was doing that, I was approached by the Dr. Dak Kopek of the human health part of the BAC to help me, to help his students with this existence therapy space that is located in Boston for a tier 3 school that deals with kids with high-risk kids that live in a really bad neighborhood and have a lot of personal issues that they're dealing with. And I told them that these kids, it would be considered trauma-centered design because what they're actually doing is they're not being a therapist at this point. If I read the data correctly, they were trying to treat a trauma that these kids are going through because they have to deal with violence in their neighborhood, violence at home, parents are not there, and they have to be in a high-stress, high-anxiety environment at all times. This is the same kind of thing you would find from a soldier that suffers from PTSD. So what they were suffering from was PTSD, and it was showing, and it was affecting their neurocognitive development because where their emotions were in their brain development You can see they had the emotional ability of a 6-month-old, quick to anger, quick to sadness, happiness. It was all very quick. And so that needed to be developed more and not punished. It's what they went through or what they were going through is not their fault. So we looked at different ways of how we could try to get rid of some of the triggers, put in round tables so no one had a hierarchy. In the isolation rooms, they have put in something that they could hit. Some of the students that had really serious frustrations, like a punching dummy that they can attack and get their frustrations out. A wall that they can throw a ball against, so they didn't have to look at the therapist, because I don't know about you, but I don't know how many times I've sat with a teacher or my parents across from a table and talked to them all of my problems. Never in the history has this ever been done. But students will talk to you if they don't have to look at you. It's really interesting that if you give them something to focus on, and they can throw a ball against the wall, for example, and they don't have to talk to you, but if you stand next to them and throw a ball against the wall without saying anything, they'll eventually talk. But first, you have to wait for the trigger to stop. You have to wait for the frustration to end. Then they'll be able to talk. So the next place I looked at was the Carter School that was handed to me. That was handed to me. It was located in Boston. It deals with kids with significant physical disabilities and neurocognitive disabilities. And it's located right next to a train, so it made for an interesting time. The train is literally right across from them. They could reach out their hands and touch them if they wanted to. And how this school is put together, it's not a very nicely shaped school. They have a lot of things. This school was only supposed to be a temporary building for them 20 years ago, but they're still there. One of the first things I was looking at is a noise barrier, because, again, this is a cinder block building with a train going right past them. So I asked my friend, Patty Manzel, how would I put up a wall barrier? She said that she stims to the grout in bricks, so not to use a straight wall. A curvy wall, she might run her hand across or really become attached to this wall. But if I curved it in and have it bulged out, it might push her away from the wall, that she wouldn't be bothered by it, but the curve might actually make the sound go in on itself. So things like that was just figuring out different ways of how this would work. If I took the bus drop off and pick up and separate it from the car drop off and pick up, it would be less traffic and less saturation of people in one area, which would make it less anxiety and stress for those trying to drop off and pick up their kids, especially for the faculty. They had a garden that was already developed by DPLA that was a sensory garden that introduced different smells, different textures, different sounds, that, if you notice, has curves and rounds and waves, which is great. Has a water feature in it that is visited frequently. And the only problem, it had chain link fence that it was along the exterior part of the garden, that a lot of people were depositing their needles of drug paraphernalia through the fence and into their garden. So they're now trying to figure out a way to block that, which is something I don't think, I feel sad that this is something that people would do to a playground for kids. But and then looked at the building itself and the wonky shape that it is, how studies have proved that curves and waves are very calming to the mind and body. So I was trying to put more curves and waves in higher stressor areas. So this is the lobby of the existing building. I was told that checkerboard patterns is very disorienting and never to use them. If you notice, there's stuff all over the walls. They were having an issue with a student that would attack pictures of students, especially if the student that had the picture was up in the same room, because the picture of that student was an imposter and the real person was right there. So he didn't understand that this was a picture. And so they would have to take down the pictures of students of the month and stuff like that, because the student, we become so agitated at the pictures. What I suggested was pushing away the furniture away so that when you walk into the building, the person can walk in without worrying about people being right on top of them when they walked in or being in the way. And I looked at putting a sensory room right off of the lobby so that if there was a bad day on the bus, they can go in the sensory room and calm down. Or if it's a bad day in school, you want to keep them away from other students, you can put them in the sensory room to calm down. I also looked at rounding out the corners of all the walls because a lot of times a lot of these students cannot see the corners of the walls, or they see them as a physical pain towards them. So I tried to round out the walls. I also tried to introduce waves into the ceiling because it actually helps bring in natural light, lowers the acoustic levels in the room as well. This is their cafeteria they have. It can fit one lady, the woman who makes the food. That's it. It's a 17-foot by 10 inches by 11-foot by 8-inch room. Sorry, that was my chair. And it really doesn't have that much. And we all know that lunch is a very important factor in school because it gives you socialization, which all students should have. I looked at making it, because I know it was going to be a high social impact area, again, getting rid of hierarchies, making round tables, curving out the wall so that I knew it was going to be a very stressful environment, making a pass-through cafeteria area where you didn't have to look up and look at people because some anxieties is looking people in the face. But if you have a pass-through, you're able to grab what you needed to grab without that anxiety of having to look someone in the face. I then looked at their hallway. Their hallway is only 6 feet wide, so not wide enough to let 2 wheelchairs pass each other, and not wide enough for parametric space, which is parametric space is if you hold your hands out wide, it's the 3 inches away from your fingertips is parametric space. I looked at making it 12 feet, but I realized I did a little bit wrong. If I were to think of the Stephen Hawking effect, that he has this wheelchair that is automated, and standard wheelchair circumference only is for a regular size wheelchair. It's not for the wheelchairs that Stephen Hawking used. So even our ADA laws are behind on this because we do not design for chairs that are mechanical chairs. We only do that you can lay back, you can have the computer on for talking. We only design for a standard chair, and that needs to change, which is, I believe, 96 inches is the circumference for those chairs. So I suggested that if you're going to do a long hallway, you need to do a sensory area off of that hallway. So if the student has an issue going down the long hallway, at least you can go put him to the side, let him calm down, get his bearings before you put him into the hallway again. We also know that some students like to take a swipe at other students if they get too close. But if you give a wall that's engaging to that student, let them run a marble across it, give it a texture, let them drive a car across it, that they'll become so engaged or engrossed within that wall that they won't notice the people going next to them. So this is their classrooms that they have right now. They really don't have furniture. They don't have storage space. They had to cover up the lighting because even though they have LED lighting, the LED lighting was too bright for them. And it would set a lot of the students off and giving them behavior issues because even though it was LED lights, it would upset the students. I went a little crazy on the lights because I have it as full lighting, but if you give them an option between the lighting of full bright light, you can dim it down, you can turn off one set, you can turn on another set, giving them full control of how they want the lighting in the room, and giving that control, it would be helpful. But also use full spectrum lighting because, again, as Erika said, it interrupts your circadian rhythms. If you use white LED lights or yellow LED lights, make people become irritated. But if you use full spectrum light, it's the same as being in full daylight, and it would be helping with the melatonin levels and circadian rhythms. I also looked at different ways of doing different furniture. instead of doing the typical desks where the edges of the kids in wheelchairs could accidentally hit themselves or become cumbersome. If you do a hugging motion, it will calm down the students that need to have that support. But it would also put a divider up so that the kids with ADHD don't become too agitated by the students that are around them, and wiggle chairs and things like that. I also looked at beige walls. I know teachers hate beige walls, but beige doesn't register as a color to the brain, and it makes it so that they'll pay attention to what's going on in front of their classroom. I know that teachers like to put a lot of flair and stuff like that on the walls to make it homey. The only problem is if you have ADHD like me, you're paying more attention to what's on the walls than what the teacher is saying. And it also makes you very hyper, and you're running around and interrupting the classroom when if you didn't put the stuff on the walls, it would actually give us nothing to look at, and we'll have to pay attention to what's going up in front of us. This is their gross motor room. Again, nothing for them to work with, and there's stuff all over the place, so students tend to grab things that they're not supposed to, what they're not working on. I did look at what gross motor room is. Now, it's important to realize that looking at this image, there's a lot of color and a lot of stuff, and it's very bright. That's the purpose of that, is to actually get you energized. Color is a very powerful tool. It can make you very hyper, especially if you have autism or ADHD. But it can make you have to be able to do it in a certain way. You have to be very careful of it. And a gross motor room is important to put a lot of color in, because that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to get out that extra energy before you send them off into class. Sensory rooms is actually different. Right now you have your isolation room, which is typical in schools, which is the top picture that you use when students having meltdown. The sensory integration room introduces them to certain senses with a professional that they do not like, that they try to move away from. So it's trying to get through therapy, get them used to those senses so that they can function within the public. And then there's the snozzling room, which is my favorite, which is basically Dutch for sniff and doze. It's used for those with pervasive developmental disabilities and cognitive impairment. It gives them the sense of weightlessness. They give a weightless, or they can have the weight blanket. It calms them down. It's much easier than the top room, which gets rid of everything. And to be all fair, the top image of what of the de-escalation space is by far the worst, because if you're putting it in there to get rid of their aggravation, I don't know about you, but if I was thrown into a closet when I'm really mad, the only thing it would do is make me madder. So there's that issue. So I looked at making group sensory room versus a quiet room for one person and how that worked. And if I combine the two together, which wouldn't really work because you want them to be more energized for gross motor. But if they have issues with those kind of things, then using a sensory room like a gross motor room could work. So again, this is the existing conditions they have for lighting. I suggest, I know some bubble lights are great, but they can be very distracting, but they're actually very therapeutic. If you put them in a sensory room, that'd probably be a good idea because they tend to zone out to those. Full spectrum lighting, acoustical wave tile, were just architectural factors. There's also some other ones that I've been able to find when a few people who needed a quick cheat getting through the hallway. No transitioning is very hard. I told them if they made a necklace of cork from wine bottles that a student can pick on, they would not pick on the walls if you gave them something to pick on that they can walk with as they go through the room. If you cover, I know daylighting is very important, but it's very distracting for us with ADHD. We'll tend to look out the window more than pay attention to the teacher. But if you let the natural daylight in, but cover it in the frost, you'll still get the benefits of daylighting, but you won't get the distraction. I believe what it's called is neurohabilitation or ecotherapy or forest bathing, is by being out in the middle of a greenery, and it's known for being very therapeutic. But for people with ADHD, we tend to look at everything around us and not pay attention to the person in front of us. Or sometimes the facial expressions are so interesting to us, we will be looking you straight in the eye and not hear a word you say because your facial expressions are so fascinating, we're not even paying attention to what you're saying. I looked at matte flooring, so it's not shiny, so you're not worried that you're walking on wet floors. I looked at calming cool colors, not highly saturated colors, so pastels. I looked at, because they can hear more, they can hear 10 times more than we do. I looked at double insulation in walls, using walls that are they kind of look like stucco. It's called ephes. It looks like stucco. It can come together in panels, and it has insulation built into it, and then have insulation on top of that, so they don't have to worry about hearing trucks go by or the honking of buses, as Erika discussed, and those kind of things. And then I looked at the roof, which is always neglected. And the reason I looked at green roofs is because the grass on green roofs, or vegetation on green roofs, muffle the sound of sleet, rain, and hail. So you don't have to worry about that irritated patter that goes on, like the kitchen sink video that I had just shown up earlier. The kitchen sink, the dripping of that sink became the whole world for that person. And if you can hear the patter of rain or the pattern of hail, it becomes that person's whole world. So this is just a list of things that they have that's existing. They didn't have a life skills lab, which is very important. I'm happy that some schools are now introducing it. A life skills lab is an apartment. It's basically a studio apartment layout where students learn how to make the bed, clean the bathroom, these things that we don't teach them as parents because we don't think about it. We don't think about these small details because we do it for them. But right now, my son is learning how to get dressed by himself. It's part of his curriculum. It's part of his life skills. He'll also learn what we called learning a proper way of dealing with police officers, because we realize that people with autism necessarily do not listen to, hey, stop, hands up in the air, those kind of things. So we are doing that right now, which we're calling life safety as well, because for him, it would literally be a life safety, because when people ask him to do things, he'll tend to run away or bolt from them. So trying to figure out ways of making it so he doesn't get hurt or unintentionally, because he is nonverbal. So he can't say, hey, I have autism. So we're trying to make sure that we have a good outcome if he should ever get out again, which he's bolted before. He's bolted twice on us. So, and this was, I put the learning core in the middle of the building. I know daylight is very important, but for people, again, I myself am very high ADHD with light sensitivity, so I work in the dark with my screen, my computer screen, no windows for my office. I put sensory rooms within the classroom, so I don't have to worry about teachers going out into the hallway with the student that's having the tantrums or having the meltdowns or having the explosive disorders or self-inflicting disorders and accidentally hitting other teachers, faculty, students walking by, and being able to have that control right there in the classroom without that added factor of trying to navigate the student through a hallway full of other students. So those were a couple of things I was able to touch on when I was doing my thesis. And that's all that I had for you guys. But I just wanted to let you guys know that it's not something these students can control. They're not bad students. It's not their fault. And it sometimes always feels like it's, as a person who has a disability, anytime something happens, we take it the hardest. I know the teachers put up with a lot, and you guys have, when it comes to getting new schools and stuff like that, often when they're doing budget cuts on those schools, you're the first to get your stuff, your budgets cut. which I find it very hard. They think that it's a small detail of something and you wouldn't notice, or the students that are using the building won't notice, which is wrong. The students who notice the most are the ones with the cognitive disabilities, because we're all about details. We live for details, even the smallest details. So I will pass this back on to Erika.
Well, we'll head to you, Elisabeth.
Thank you very much, both of you. I'm going to take over again and go to my slide where we're going to introduce Laura Wernick, who is going to talk us about some examples of how they approach acoustics and why it's so important. Laura, take it from here.
Great, thank you. Well, I think Laura really spoke very eloquently about some of the stressors created by acoustics and the importance of making sure that acoustics are controlled. There are other reasons as well. For instance, getting back to the notion of kids are not just small adults. As adults, when we hear someone speaking, and perhaps a little bit, we're not hearing every single word, we have enough information, enough context to really understand the intent of what is being said. Kids, young children don't have that background context. So if they're not hearing every single word being said, they cannot necessarily put together that meaning. So they can lose big chunks of learning if the acoustics within the room and the intelligibility of the person speaking is not totally clear. So acoustics, so that the students can hear exactly what's being said, taking care of acoustics so that you don't have the kinds of stressors that Laura spoke so eloquently about. But also acoustics are important because for the teachers. Teachers having to speak loudly continually, having to repeat themselves continually, causes stress for the teacher and wears down the teacher as well. So for all of these reasons, acoustics are critical for any learning environment. The image up here is of Winthrop High School, and you'll see in the upper right-hand corner an airplane going by. Winthrop High School is just a few miles from Logan Airport, so it's continually day in and day out bombarded by the noise from the airplanes. So particular care had to be taken in designing the building envelope. There's extra gypsum sheathing on the building, on the walls and on the roof to provide extra protection against external noises. All of the windows are triple glazed windows, which is great for energy efficiency, by the way, but also great for protecting against the external noises from whether it's airplanes or traffic noise or sirens. So it makes the building incredibly quiet on the inside from those external noises. And you can be standing in that building and watching that airplane flying by, and you will not hear it. Noise between spaces can be very disruptive. So if you have a loud space, a project area, or a music room, extra attention has to be taken both in the type of wall construction between those two rooms, so extra density, extra layers of sheetrock, also careful sealing at the top and the bottom. So the wall has to go all the way up to the deck of the floor below and then be sealed, acoustically sealed at the joints so that no noise can seep through at any joints. So the room-to-room noise is very important. Within a given room, there can be noise caused by mechanical systems. The movement of air, if you're having air blowing across the space, that can be a disruptive noise. It doesn't have to be much, again, to reduce the intelligibility of speech. The floor surface, having metal bottom chairs with metal tips dragged across the floor can cause noise that will reduce the intelligibility of speech. So all of these things put together can be disruptive to the student's learning ability. In larger spaces, think about the cafeteria or the gym, you have a different acoustical issue. in that you want those often have very large volumes with hard surfaces. Often a gym will have concrete block walls or metal ceilings, metal ductwork. So we need to have extra absorptive materials that have holes in them so that they can absorb the reverberation. Noise bounces off walls very easily, but if you have soft absorptive materials, that noise is getting absorbed. It's no longer bouncing around. You're no longer getting the reverberation that can make those spaces so untenable. So all of those things really can be very disruptive to the learning experience. These days, we're often designing large open volumes for media centers and for maker spaces or learning commons, where multiple activities can be taking place inside one volume. We've just designed a school that has a learning commons with dining at one end of it and quiet study space at the other end of it. So in that case, we've had to be very careful about making sure there was extra absorptive materials on the floor and on the ceilings, on the walls, and also the furniture becomes very important in those conditions. So we actually use very soft and high-backed seating chairs and couches, so that the seating itself acts as a barrier and a sound absorber for excess sound. So every space has to be thought of from the outside, from the external noises, from internal noises within the space, and then the noise between spaces. So all of these things have to be considered when you're thinking about acoustics within a classroom and within a school. So on that, I think I'd hand it back to Elisabeth.
Thank you very much, Laura. So we have about 10 minutes left for questions. And again, one of the required slides if you're interested in getting the AIA credits. And here's how to contact us, including Claire, if you have any questions afterwards. But there are a couple different ways you can submit questions. You can raise your hand in the attendee section. You can submit something by chat, or there is a questions section. You can submit something there too. So if anyone has a question, just either send it through chat or let me know by raising your hand and I can unmute you. So go ahead. And I want to say, I want to say thank you to all of our speakers. I think that there's still a lot more we could cover, and perhaps we'll be able to do a follow-up on this in the near future. So thank you all again. Any questions from anyone? Oh, Claire has a question. Go ahead.
I have a question for the first Laura on sensory integrated design. And that is when your recommendations on the curved walls and acoustical wave ceilings are implemented, what kind of differences do you see in student behavior? I mean, my assumption is that everybody's a little calmer, and I can't understand why we wouldn't do this for every school, not just special schools. But I'm wondering if you have particular observations about student behavior you can share.
A lot of the stuff that I was able to get was from architects that have done it, and they didn't know how to collect the data, which I told them the data would be better collected through behavior. So if you see a downward turn of outbursts in certain areas, because I know that you guys collect data through how students interact or how students act. I get many reports saying, oh, your son was put in an isolation room for this kind of thing because he was in, it's always during transition and it's always in hallways. But my next step is to take the data that involves, letting a school let me take the data and seeing where the trouble is, which I know a lot of it's been the acoustics in cafeterias, in gymnasiums, in hallways, and transitioning through those spaces. and then try to figure out a way to work in with data with that. But first, trying to let schools let me in so that I can show them this, because I have the research and I've seen the backing and seen what other architects have done. But, and again, it's all about the schools getting the funding, but finding new creative ways also helps as well, which I'm still getting into.
Right. I would assume, I would think something like tracking timeout or tracking time in a meltdown area.
The school that let me do the trauma-centered design said that when they put that punching bag thing in, they saw a drop in student. I guess they timed how long the students were in the isolation room by putting something in for focusing their rage. They were able to get down to 20 minutes to 15 minutes before they were an hour-long episodes of these students having explosive disorders, which a lot of them had IED, or intermittent explosive disorder, or used to be called berserker disorder, where they would have explosive episodes of violence. This was actually, and now they were willing to go in. They'll leave independently, go in there, have their moment when they're upset about something, and then come out, where before they were not willing to go into that room.
That's great. Thank you.
This is Elisabeth. I have a question for Erika. Can you tell us exactly what structural soil is? And is it more than just amending the soil on the site so that you can have plantings?
Yeah, so it's actually interesting research coming out of Cornell, and basically it's an excavation of the previous soil that's there. So it's actually the material that you use quite different, so it creates bigger gaps and spaces between each of the soil, pieces, and so therefore the roots are allowed to go sort of deeper, wider, and get those nutrients. Where you see in urban environments, the ground is usually packed down pretty hard, and so you're not able to sort of allow that tree to optimize its growth, where this allows it to have a little bit more of that sort of biological availability of those nutrients and resources.
Oh, thank you. That was helpful. We have a question for anyone who wants to answer it. She says, I'd like to better understand the roadblocks to this kind of design. Is it mainly ignorance or lack of awareness, or lack of funding for a consultant to advise architects?
Sorry, who was that for?
For you, I think.
That's for anyone.
I think it would probably be lack of awareness itself. Not a lot of people know what sensory processing disorder is, for my answer, and what effects they have. And a lot of architects don't know that the built environment has so many stressors when in it. So it's now going to the architecture firms and letting us consult on it, and letting us show them what their buildings are doing to these students, because again, they're developing brains, so they're not in control with a lot of things that they're doing, compounded if they have a neurocognitive disorder.
I had a question about, I think this is Claire, I had a quick question on that. Do you sense that there's a large extra cost or cost neutral? What are the construction design changes you're considering, or the wall texturing? Is that an extra cost or cost neutral, do you think?
Things like rounding the corners of walls are not an extra cost too much, depending on how round you make the walls. Putting texture to the walls, there's a school for blind that did it with using particle board. So it depends all on what your budget is. The wall texture that I showed is naturally, it's something that I picked up I think Laura Wernick probably knows the company that does it. But it all depends on what your cost is. And it can either help your cost or hinder your cost, depending on what it is. I know full spectrum LED lights might be a little bit more expensive, but if you only put them in the rooms that they'll be in more, i.e. classrooms, you can put the regular lights in the hallways. it all depends on how you want to use your budget. And there's other ways of doing it where you don't have to do it in the strict architecture sense. You can also do certain other things as well, like color. It's not an added cost to go with pastels, from what Temple Grandin told me, not to oversaturate, use pastels. That is helpful. Use calming, cool colors. Don't use bright, loud colors because they tend to overexcite. Try not to use too many colors in a room. Stick to 1 or 2. 3 is pushing it. And those kind of things. And I think she also had a student that had a problem with reading black on white paper to the point where he was almost dropping out of college because of that much of a color change. That she recommended the student use a pastel blue paper with black ink, and he's doing fine now. But it's that kind of powerful thing that that color can even have on it. So,
and I think, to add to Laura's point, I think what's also important to realize is that when we're sort of factoring in what is the cost to benefit ratio, in a lot of these cases, even if we can't maybe necessarily understand what the impact is sort of acutely, and say at the end of the operating budget for this year, we've had this, because we've put in curved walls, it might actually be something that is a little bit more longitudinal, and that's where the research can kind of play this interesting role. But as we have these examples, how do we see the long-term impact? Yeah. We see that teacher retention is actually higher when we make these, changes. And is that really an added benefit that we're seeing that, if we look too sort of narrowly, we miss this opportunity to say, what is the big picture and how does it all come together? Because I think the benefit is something that we actually haven't been able to quantify totally, even in, a setting where you may have children who don't have the same, stressors in their life. I think I really value Laura's point about sort of trauma-induced, trauma-informed design, because I think it's something where we have to be thinking about what is the population we're really trying to serve. And we understand some of these physiological stressors, but all of the other sort of social, mental, cognitive have to be also a part of that. And until we spend the time to do these longitudinal studies, I wonder if we've really understood the full benefits.
And it might cut down on classroom destruction, which is desk destruction, chair destruction, book destruction, and that kind of thing, because now it gives them a place to go if they need it, and they're not stressed or triggered anymore. And that cost will go down of replacing these things that were broken because a student has gotten angry and you couldn't get them to that isolation space or that isolation room in time. So that might cost, the cost might be saving in the long run because you're not worried about that kind of thing.
There really is a combination of both cost and awareness, and they really go hand in hand. The work that Erika's group is doing and the work that Laura is doing are just so critical to raising awareness, both among architects and among clients and educators. There are costs associated with certain aspects. If you're trying to get good air quality, best air quality, if you're trying to get good acoustical quality, those can add cost. It becomes particularly sensitive when you're in urban areas where the noise impacts are likely to be the highest, where the kids are coming with the most stressors in their own lives, and where the budgets are often the tightest. So schools being designed have a lot of factors. There are a lot of issues that are going into the design of schools to make sure that they're durable and long-lasting, to make sure they are healthy, to make sure they're energy efficient, to make sure they're meeting the educational goals of students of all ages and abilities. So there's a lot going in. Budgets are typically very tight, and the more awareness there is of the critical nature of these particular health related attributes, the more focus and attention is put on them. I'm just going to one for instance, the lighting. LED lights used to be very expensive, very rare, but because there's been more demand, more awareness of their properties, they've become more available, more cost effective. Now we're trying to get more focus on bringing down the cost of lighting that's more full spectrum and actually adjustable, so that the circadian rhythms can be adapted to. The lighting can actually support circadian rhythms over the course of the day. That lighting now is very expensive, but when there's more awareness and more demand, I think those prices will come down as well. So there's the awareness and the cost kind of go hand in hand. And then there's also the making sure that it's being constructed precisely and detailed carefully and constructed precisely, so that those little edges are done correctly, so that everything really works to achieve all of the goals that you're trying to achieve.
Thank you, Laura. That was a great answer. We are out of time, and I don't see any further questions. You can feel free to email any questions to me at the info@chips.net email address. And with that, I'm going to say thank you again to everyone. Thank you for joining us, and thank you to our speakers. And, oops, I do see one more question. Let's see. Oh, you're welcome, Katie. I'm glad you enjoyed it. So take care, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.